So I'm a 32-year-old female, and this is something that happened to me only 2 nights ago. My husband, Kevin, and I were on the porch smoking a cigarette, and it was about 9 o'clock at night. We live far out in the woods, right off a stretch of highway that's between 2 interstate exits. We were looking up at the stars, enjoying the quiet atmosphere of the crickets, glad to have a temporary relief from all of the usual traffic noise. But I heard something and shushed my husband, even though he hadn't said anything. And was that screaming? Yeah, it was a woman screaming like nothing I'd ever heard before. And it sounded like she was getting murdered or something. In between blood-chilling screams, she was screaming out, help me, and I looked at my husband, and we were both really freaked out. The more she screamed, the closer she was getting to the house, too. I could eventually see a figure running along the median of the highway, making their way closer to the part of the highway that was in front of our house. Our house is a good ways back from our driveway, but not far enough that you can't see anything. And if we could see her, then that meant that she could see us. We have no yard security lights, stupid I know, so we were in complete darkness at this point. But we could still see the highway perfectly fine due to the house across from us, who still had their Christmas lights up though. I threw my cigarette in my yard and back up to stand in my doorway of the house, pulling out my phone to call 911. She's still in the median of the road screaming too. If anyone else in the surrounding houses heard her, they pretended like they didn't know. Kevin runs past me inside to get his jacket and his shoes on. I tell him not to go out there, obviously, but he ignores me and gets dressed anyway. As soon as he's out of sight, I see a red car barrel up the road and pull over next to where the lady was at. With her in the median, there was still a stretch of highway between them, though. But there was a man driving. I couldn't see what he looked like, though. I only heard his voice. He was yelling that he was going to kill her and calling her every name under the sun. It looked like he was throwing stuff at her out the window. Maybe clothes, I think. As soon as she sees him pull over, she starts running straight towards our yard. By that time, I was already on the phone with the police officers, but as I said, I lived out in the woods, pretty far out of town, I'll add, so it would take them a bit to get here. I yell for my husband, and I tell my 9-year-old son to go in our room where the baby is and close the door. He can hear the whole thing and was actually pretty frightened. My husband runs out onto the porch and into the yard towards her. He asks if she's okay, and she says that she had gotten a ride home from this guy, and halfway down the road, he started acting really creepy. He refused to let her out where she told him to, and kept driving with her in the car. She looked behind her seat, pretending to look at a car behind them, and saw a roll of duct tape. Fearing for her life, she jumped out of the moving car and just started running down the road, screaming for help. Kevin starts to lead her towards the house, and by now is also on the phone calling the police, having gathered more information that I wasn't able to give them when I had called. They told him to stay on the line with them until an officer showed up, and he lets her in the house, and her face just looks terrible. She's bright red and bleeding in a couple of spots, road rash from where she jumped out. She also said that he had hit her before she was able to escape. So she came in and we locked our door, knob, deadbolt and chain. But we stood together near the window waiting for the police to show up, Kevin giving updates and answering questions on the phone. No, they haven't gotten here yet. Yes, his car is still parked across the highway. It's a red sedan in front of the house with lots of blue porch Christmas lights, all that sort of stuff. I was trying not to lose my crap when there was a huge bang on our door. The man was yelling, "I know you're in there. I saw you running. The people in there can't protect you." I shouted through the door that he needed to leave our property and if he was smart to get in his car and drive off. I told him that we were on the phone to the police, and the answer he gave was the worst one that I could have heard. He says, "Go ahead, call the police. I don't care. They won't even be here in time." And then starts banging on the door over and over again. But the woman was freaking out and crying, saying, "Help me, please help me," over and over again. I ran into the kitchen to get a large knife just in case. We had a huge solid iron door, but our windows were easily breakable. If he wanted to get in badly enough, he certainly could have. My husband just came from our bedroom with his gun when my squad car pulled up into the yard. two more following behind it and one across the street where his car was. He took off on foot, running, and they tended to the woman and got her home safely. Turns out, too, that she lives on the highway across from us, 5 houses to the left. It had been 2 hours later, and they still hadn't found him as well. There are a lot of places to hide in these woods as well, and I just hope that he hides somewhere far away from here, because I do not want to see that guy again. So my name is Eric, and I live in a rural area of central New Mexico. I'm 18 years old, and I've lived there for nearly all my life. It's a pretty quiet, tight-knit place where everyone seems to know everyone, and this story took place about 2 years ago when I was a sophomore in high school. So me and one of my school buddies, Seth, we were going through somewhat of a mild obsession with urban exploration videos on YouTube. I had recently passed my driver's test, and Seth and I were talking about finding somewhere nearby where we could go urban exploring, or, I guess in our case, rural exploring. One day when I was driving Seth home from school, he told me about an abandoned radio tower on top of a mountain about 25 miles east of town that he thought would be really cool to explore. He showed me some pictures of the place, and it did look pretty cool. It was located about 5 miles up what looked like to be a narrow dirt road that branched off the main highway in and out of town. It was cool because we had always driven past that road too, but I never really thought about where it led. We both agreed then that we had to go and check it out, and I told him that that Friday night would be the best time to go. I don't know why we thought it would be better to go at night, but for some stupid reason we just did. My parents were really chill about letting me drive late at night, and so were his. We usually went out on Friday nights to meet up with friends from school anyway, so our parents didn't hesitate to let us go. Obviously, we didn't tell them about exploring the cell tower though, as they would never have let us go to some abandoned place in the middle of nowhere late at night. It was a stupid decision, I know, but we didn't expect to be very long, and certainly didn't expect any trouble. We left at about 8 PM, and by the time that we got to the tower, the sun had set, and it was almost completely dark. The road to the top was surrounded by forest on both sides. Soon after turning onto the dirt road, there was a cattle gate that we had to get out and open. I didn't realize just how big the tower was until we actually saw it up close. The tower itself was probably about 100 feet tall, with a white building about the size of an average house at its base. We parked my Chevy about 20 yards from the tower and walked towards the building with our flashlights out. As we expected, the building's doors were locked, but we were able to crawl through a loosely boarded up window. But the first thing we noticed about the place was just the unsettling musty smell. This place seemed to have been unused for quite some time at this point, as there was almost nothing in there besides a few tables and chairs. The walls were completely bare except for a few spots of graffiti, and it was completely silent except for the creaking of the floorboards. Then, suddenly, we both heard what sounded like the hum of an engine coming up the road. Seth and I ran to the front of the building and peered out a hole in one of the boarded-up windows, and to our horror, there was a set of headlights coming up the road. We looked at each other and asked who the hell could possibly be up here with us at 9 o'clock at night. We watched as an old Ford pickup pulled up right next to my car, and what looked like 2 middle-aged men get out. We couldn't see their faces, but they were both wearing dark clothing and were clearly wearing hooded sweatshirts. They immediately took our flashlights and began looking into the passenger window of my car. One of the men seemed to point to something in my car, and the other man appeared to shake his head as if in agreement. After a couple more seconds, they shined their flashlights up at the house, and I could barely make out one of them saying, "I bet they're still in there." At this point, Seth is freaking out, and I have to admit that I was too. And then the men began walking towards the building. So we instinctively began looking for a hiding spot. Maybe this was the wrong move, but we didn't know what else to do. We found one of those small storage rooms underneath the stairs leading up to the second floor of the building. We closed the door and both crouched down in the darkness, all the while shaking in fear. Seth began to say something, but I quickly told him to be quiet. and there was nothing but silence for what seemed like a good 2 minutes, and I actually started to wonder if maybe the men had left. But my thinking was interrupted by the sound of one of the men kicking down the padlocked door. The noise was so loud that I swear I nearly had a heart attack too, and Seth and I were both terrified when we heard the sound of the mostly rotten wooden door breaking in half before the loud crash of it falling onto the wooden floorboards. Light filled the underside of the small door to the room that we were in as the men shined their flashlights around the building. It was strange, though, as they never said a word to each other or called out for us or anything. I was just waiting for the door to the storage room to swing open and for us to be goners, but to our surprise, the men just never opened it. After about 5 minutes of hearing the men rummaging around the bottom floor, we both heard the creaking of the stairs above our heads as the men began to walk up them. And as soon as the men reached the second floor, I whispered to Seth that this was our chance and that we had to try and sneak out of this place and back to the car. He whispered in agreement, and I led him out of the small storage space as we attempted to find our way out of the door that the men had kicked in. But we were trying to be absolutely as silent as we could, but as we were walking out, I managed to trip over something that was on the floor. I fell down onto the ground with a loud thud that the men definitely heard. And at this point, Seth and I just started running out through the door and towards our car. All the while, we could hear the 2 men running back down the stairs behind us. We practically leapt into the car and didn't waste a second hauling us out of there and back down the road towards the highway too. But we were so scared that I'd be willing to bet that we hit close to 60 miles per hour down this narrow dirt road. Luckily, it appeared that we got the jump on the 2 men as we thankfully never saw headlights behind us. I was fretting about the cattle gate that we had to pass on our way up the mountain though, as I knew that I would have to get out and open it in order for us to get through. As we rounded a bend, Seth and I both saw the closed gate in front of us, and I quickly jumped out of the car and opened up the gate as fast as I possibly could. I could hear the sound of a vehicle further up the road too as I jumped back into the car, and we just sped off, not bothering to close the gate behind us. In what seemed like only about 5 minutes, we reached the bottom of the dirt road and turned onto the main highway. We quickly made our way back to my house, all the while looking in our mirrors hoping that the men hadn't followed us. Thankfully, it looked like we had lost them, and when we got back home to my house, both Seth and I breathed a collective sigh of relief and told each other that we would never go back there again. We didn't tell any of our parents about what had happened, as we knew that they would be furious at us for doing something like we did without telling them. The next day, Seth and I sat down and talked about what had happened the night before, and we just didn't understand who the men were and why they were up at the radio tower so late at night. We also were creeped out by the fact that the men just somehow saw us going up the dirt road and followed us. I really don't know what those 2 men were doing, but I honestly don't think I want to either. So I was super skeptical of the paranormal or anything ghostly for years. Until I was on vacation with my family at the Waverly Hill Sanitarium, and we were going on a tour from about 6 p.m. to 6 a.m. on an overnight lock-in kind of deal. Now, I don't believe in anything that's about to occur. We start in the infamous death tunnel or body chute, where the guy proceeded to tell us that at one point the whole tunnel was piled full of bodies top to bottom, which was pretty cool to be honest. There's nothing unusual and just graffiti down there too. We walk up to the first floor and still same thing, graffiti, some pentagrams and all that sort of stuff. Fast forward and nothing's going on, and I'm kind of fascinated by the building, moonlight shining in through the sunroom, all that sort of stuff. As we pass the 4th floor, the guide asks us all to turn our lights off and tells us the 4th floor is the most active, we'll come back here later too. So we do as we're told and turn off our flashlights. My brother puts his in his pocket of his hoodie, and I watched him do this. Then a few minutes later, I see light out of the corner of my eye. I say to my brother, "Turn off your flashlight," and he says it is. And not even a minute later, I see it again. I tell him to turn off the flashlight again, and it was on again, and he says that I swear I didn't turn it on. He says to me that it's definitely turned off now, and I don't think too much of it, so the tour continues. We get back down to the 4th floor, and we all pile into the center of the hallway, and the guide asks for a volunteer, and I say, screw it, I'll do it. I have no clue what I'm doing, but what the hell, it can't be too bad, right? So the guide tells me to walk down the end of the hallway, slowly, keeping your eyes forward, touch the wall and come back. I say alright, so I start walking, and I'm not gonna lie, it was pretty creepy dark, and I have my flashlight off, and the only light is the moon coming in through the sunroom, which is sufficient lighting, but it really wasn't much. So I'm good, and it's eerie, and it's like really quiet, so I'm walking, and I swear that I start to see shadows out of the corner of my eye, like brushing by, but when I try and look directly, there's nothing there. To my right is where the sunroom and the shadows are, and to my left are the rooms. I'm walking, just getting chills, and I get to the end of the hall, and I feel like I'm floating. It's hard to describe, but it just felt like I was levitating or something. I can't see anyone, and it's a really weird feeling, so I start to walk back, and I'm curious on what's been going on, and to my left, and now my right, the rooms are there, so I'm walking back, and I feel like I'm walking on clouds, and I look into room 423, and I swear to you that I see someone, clear as day, sitting in a chair with no eyes. Obviously, I start to panic, but I try to keep my composure and keep walking now with a knot in my throat, heart pounding, and I get back to the group pale as a dead man, and they ask what's wrong, and I say nothing. I just felt like I was floating. The tour guide says, yeah, that's what I was going for at this point. Now, I know that I'm not tripping. I don't do drugs, and I know my mental health is pretty decent enough to not have hallucinations and whatnot. And what I saw was definitely real, I began to think anyway. We continue the tour though, and I keep my eyes locked on that room, and I didn't see anybody leave or anyone go in, and we get to the room and I walk in, and I just feel really heavy. Again, it's hard to describe, but I just felt condensed and heavy. The chair is laid out on its left side, and I'm searching the room frantically to see if there's anyone hiding in the room, or even a ladder at the window or something, like a place for someone to escape or something. And I'm just completely confused. Like I said, nobody came in or went out from that room, and I kept my eyes on it the whole time. Anyway, the tour guide then says, last week when we had someone do the walk like you did, a gentleman saw something in this room, 423, that scared him so bad that he actually tried to jump out of the sunroom, and I had to pull him off of the ledge. He couldn't describe what he saw clearly, and only said that it had no eyes, and we actually had to call an ambulance because he was freaking out so bad. Obviously, that was a massive shock to me, and I said nothing, but my stomach was in my throat at this point. We complete the tour though, and now I'm a complete believer. I strongly believe too that whatever it was, it's kind of stuck to me or something too, because I still see this thing when I'm alone, walking at night in the distance under street lamps. When I'm alone in the dark, I feel a presence, and I feel like it's him. I also see him in my dreams too, and now I have this huge anxiety issue and horrible depression, and I've even began an addiction, and I know you guys might think I'm crazy, but honestly, I can't blame you for all of it, but I was fine until that day. And now this lingering thing just makes me feel like I'm never alone. I've been pretty desperate to try and fix this too, and I've had mediums, and I've spoken to Native Americans, and I've done all sorts of exorcisms and sage things, and I've even had priests bless me, but nothing has done anything. At this point, it's been 10 years since I first saw it, and I still have no idea what to do. Hey everyone. So first, I guess I should say that I'm actually Russian, so my English can be a little bit off sometimes, but I hope you'll understand the story that I'm about to tell you. So, this happened a long time ago when I was a kid. If you didn't know, Russia is filled with apartment houses, and we don't really have much space or privacy because there might be a bunch of neighbors living at the same floor with you, so everyone pretty much knows everyone. We had two entrance doors. One was made of metal, and the other behind the first one was made of wood. It was a pretty common thing for Russia in early to mid-noughties, despite the fact that they weren't really safe. So, basically, my family and I lived in a cement box behind two very thin doors. This happened at night as I got up to go to the toilet, which was near the entrance, but at first I had to go through the living room where my parents were sleeping. And so, you'll understand that that's why I wasn't allowed to turn on the lights in order to not wake up my mum and dad. And my path to get there was obviously passing through complete darkness, which I was afraid of in my childhood. Anyway, when I got to the toilet door, I saw a silhouette of a man just standing at the end of the corridor near our entrance and exit. I just stood there completely frozen, looking at him, and I was sure that this was a person, whoever it was, and they were looking at me. He was pretty tall, but normal, about 190 centimeters or so, and he was wearing all black, and I couldn't see anything but his eyes just staring at me. He kept silent, and he wasn't moving or anything. I knew that this couldn't have been any of our neighbors for sure, because I've never seen a person corresponding to his height. I took one step back, still looking at him, and then I just ran to the living room to wake up my dad. He didn't really believe me at first about the man standing in our hallway and doing literally nothing, but I insisted that he should go and make this person leave or call the police. My dad eventually got up and saw this man and said something like, "What the hell are you doing in here?" Went to him and then literally pushed him out of the apartment, although this man didn't really resist, which was really strange. And afterwards, Dad checked if the doors were locked and told me to go back to sleep. I still don't know what that was because this person just did not look like a regular burglar, at least because he wasn't doing anything. I mean, he just broke into someone's apartment and was just staring at their kid. I mean, sure, maybe if I didn't get up, he would have robbed our apartment and left. Who knows, but it was strange to say the least. Such situations are not really common in my country, especially when someone breaks into a flat full with people in the middle of the night. Something was just really off about this whole story, but I was completely awake and so was my dad for the rest of the night, and we don't really know what that person's intentions were. Either way, I'm just really glad that nothing bad happened. This happened in a city in the North Peninsula of Malaysia. So, my family was visiting my wife's cousin who had just given birth. She was in a room with 6 beds. 5 of the beds were occupied and each bed had a curtain that would be pulled around the bed. It was visiting hour and so the curtains were mostly pulled back and there were visitors at all of the beds. The cousin was in the middle bed and the last bed was occupied but the bed opposite that one was empty. So, there were people visiting at the last bed, and one of them was a young girl of perhaps, but not more than 7. As people were chatting, the girl suddenly cried out in anger, "Leave my auntie alone." Everybody looked at her, and her mother went beside her and asked, "Who are you talking to?" And she said him whilst pointing to a spot just above the empty bed. The mother asked, "What's he doing?" and she said, "He's making faces at auntie." Her mother then said to her, "That's okay, he won't do anything. Come, let's go get a drink." And then she led the girl out of the room, and I think that she was trying to calm the girl down or something. After this, I did some asking around, and I was told that that wing of the hospital is reputed to be haunted, and it was the oldest building in the hospital complex. It was a really odd experience, to say the least, and the girl was completely normal from what I could tell. It was strange, and to this day, I still don't know what to think about it. This happened a couple of years ago, and it was during a visit to my grandmother in a small village in Mexico. But to give some context, my parents and I visited for about a week, and during that week, my mother's cousin also passed. He was in a car crash, and the local government was deeply involved. Months later, it turns out that he was actually murdered by the local cartel there. That really is a whole story in itself, but I decided to mention it because it happened that same week that we were visiting. As you can probably tell, overall that whole week was tragic and also extremely odd. So, some background. It happened about a night before we got the news about the passing. My uncle lives on the same plot of land my grandmother does, and he owns a farm of chickens and roosters. My grandma's sister, the mother of the guy who passed, is technically their next-door neighbor. They own the plot of land right next to my grandmother's. My grandmother's plot of land is actually adjacent to the local elementary school there, so her house is in the middle of pretty much nowhere. However, she does have a good-sized plot of land that's surrounded by concrete walls for protection. The streets around her land only really get foot traffic when school is in session. Given the climate at the time too, any kind of foot traffic stops by sunset for sure. The village itself is pretty poor and everyone is familiar with each other there. They have a few rich people, but pretty much no middle class. Most houses are about equivalent to shacks, and my grandmother owns a concrete house that is decently sized but otherwise plain. So, it was during the summer when my parents and I visited. I was on my summer break, and so were the schools there. And my parents and I were the only people there visiting my grandmother at the time too. Every night, time is taken to be sure that all the doors are completely locked before heading to bed. But there's 3 doors that lead to the outside. All are made of metal with also a mesh-framed door to keep the bugs out. That night, I distinctly remember asking my mum to help me lock the front door too. It's a heavy metal door with a secured lock that I was having difficulties closing. We also checked to make sure that the other doors were secured and locked as well. I'm going to mention the layout of my grandmother's house briefly too, since it's somewhat important. So the first room you enter, which is the door that I was having a hard time closing, is basically a room with a bunch of beds. To the right is what is referred to as the middle room, which is just another bedroom. It connects the first room to my grandmother's room. You can actually look into the middle room and also see the first room when both doors are left open. These 2 doors are usually left open because they're heavy and scrape against the concrete floor really loudly. Now, before heading to bed, I plugged my phone into the middle room to charge, which is where my dad was going to sleep in. My mum and I were sleeping in the same room with my grandmother. My mum and I shared a bed that was right next to the door that leads into the middle room. Right before falling to sleep, I could see into the first room because the 2 doors were left open like always. I had no recollection of any nightmares or dreams, and I basically slept pitch black until I woke up at an unknown time, just completely terrified. It was the weirdest thing, but my eyes just basically shot open, and I had an indescribable sense of fear. But the first thing I noticed was that the door next to me was completely shut. I didn't want to move even in the slightest, and I didn't really know what to think. I felt too scared to even close my eyes, and I just laid there completely still for an unknown amount of time. I came to the conclusion that I would rather wait for the sun to come up than to close my eyes again, and I was just really scared. Eventually, I heard the chickens starting to make noise, so I figured the sun was going to come up in the next few hours or so. But I noticed that the chickens were actually going kind of berserk, almost as if they were scared of something. And this deepened my fear, but I still laid there too scared to move. At this point, I was wondering why it hadn't woken up my mother or my grandmother, who were both extremely light sleepers, mind you. I mean, I was the heavy sleeper in the family, yet the chickens weren't waking either of them up. Eventually, they all settled down, though, and there was no sign of any sunlight. I occupied my time just listening to the air conditioner in the middle of the room. It's pretty old, the kind that you have to use a hose to water down, and it makes a continuous noise and then occasionally sputters, but its noises are almost routine, so I kind of felt like it was comforting. I could also hear the bed in the middle of the room creaking around, which I figured my dad was just moving around in his bed or something. Again, I couldn't see into the middle room, which I found odd that the door was closed. I'm a heavy sleeper, like I mentioned, so I figured that there was a possibility that I remained asleep while the doors were closed or something. I remained still for who knows how long, but then I heard a noise that I've never, ever heard before or since. It was extremely loud, and it definitely came from the middle room. The volume was just as loud as the chickens, but didn't sound anything like them. I was petrified, and I had no idea why it didn't wake anyone else up. Again, I can't even really describe the noise because it's nothing like I've ever heard before. I just laid there completely still, though, long enough to listen to these noises just over and over again, and I wanted to think that it was the air conditioner until that noise happened the same time. I wanted to think that it was the creaking of the bed, but eventually that same noise also happened at the same time the bed was creaking, so it couldn't have been either of them. I also want to mention, too, that I didn't find it odd until later that just how much the bed was creaking. At this point, I just felt like I was going crazy. I still laid completely still, just stuck listening to the noises, and eventually a second noise started to emerge. It sounded about the same as the first noise, but it was definitely distinguishable, like when two people speak. And oddly enough, it was as if they were conversing back and forth too. I started to move my arm against my mum while whispering "Mum" over and over to try and wake her up. Like I said before, she's an extremely light sleeper, but this time she was having a really deep sleep. It got to the point, in fact, that I was basically shaking her and moving her around to try and wake her up. And finally, her eyes shot open, and in that moment she actually heard the last noise that came from the middle room. She looked petrified, and the first thing she actually said to me was, "That noise isn't from this world." After that, the noises just completely stopped. My mum got up and tried to open the door leading into the middle room as slowly as possible, but it still made a lot of noise, and the door opening woke my grandmother up. When we got into the middle room, too, there was nothing in there, and my dad was still completely asleep. I checked the time on my phone, and it was around 3 a.m. at this point, and apparently both doors in the middle room were shut completely. When we started checking around the house, too, we noticed that all the doors were left open. My grandmother said that she opened them during the night, which kind of explains it. Extremely odd that she would do something like that, to say the least, but she is pretty old and can be unreasonable like that. We looked around and checked out the outside, but aside from the doors, nothing was out of place. All we could really do was close them again and go back to bed. And the next morning I woke up to my mum talking about the event to my uncle and some other family friends who came over for breakfast. She concluded on her own that it was a witch or something, and I really don't know what it was. I only ever bring it up when a close friend talks about aliens or any odd occurrences, because, to be completely honest, it was the weirdest thing that I've ever experienced, and to this day I still have no idea what it was. Anyway, I hope you guys have enjoyed this story, and if any of you guys have had a similar experience or something like this happen to you, I sure would love to hear it, because I'm trying to find some answers for all this.